How can we use the philosophic process to make actual practical spiritual progress in our life and on our path? And how did the ancient philosophers understand the philosophic process in relation to spirituality? This is what we're going to be looking at in today's episode, and I hope you enjoy. Throughout history, philosophy has been used in a very wide array of ways. It's been used to develop physics, been used to develop mathematics and geometry, engineering, understanding biology and the life processes. Aristotle founded biology, essentially. Some of the early atomic theories go back to ancient Greece. So philosophy has had very far-reaching areas of effect throughout history. But especially in ancient philosophy, we see a constant trend towards metaphysical and spiritual speculations. And in fact, in some schools of classic philosophy, for example, particular branches within Buddhist philosophy, yogic philosophy, and especially from the Western perspective in Platonism and Pythagoreanism, we see a recurring focus where philosophy keeps circling around spiritual concepts and notions and is being associated with part of the spiritual process. In fact, what we could call spirituality in the ancient Mediterranean was largely seen as a philosophic process. They had their own indigenous forms of religion, and they had their state forms of religion and paganism. But there was a separate spiritual process that was considered to be associated with philosophy, especially from the time of Plato onwards. So how did they understand this? How did they relate philosophy to spirituality? Because in today's world, and in the way that spirituality tends to be pursued and talked about in modern parlance, there's this association or this idea that arises that somehow philosophy really is not a spiritual phenomena, that spirituality is meant to kind of go the other way from philosophy. Yet many of the world spiritual traditions are actually grounded in these old philosophic traditions, and they themselves, Buddhism, even Taoism, full of very rich philosophy that was meant to help guide the spiritual practitioner. So other than just helping you form your worldviews or helping you have reasonings and arguments for why you've taken certain worldviews and ontological stances, what was the practical way that philosophy was used in spiritual cultivation? And for this, I'm going to be focusing on this idea, this tool called dialectic. So dialectic has there's a lot of ways we can interpret it, but it's at the heart of the philosophic process. And the way that I'm going to be talking about dialectic in today's episode is largely drawn from the way that it was pursued in Platonism, and especially in later Platonism under the guidance of Plotinus and the way that he popularized its use. So in Plato, we see dialectic always playing a role. Dialectic is a way of examining something. It's a way of examining a subject, and it generally in Platonism moves from corporeal to incorporeal. It moves from specific truths to universal truths, from the part to the whole, from the known into the vaster unknown. So there's a process happening, there's a direction happening. And while dialectic can be used for kind of seemingly mundane things, right, like what's the difference between a tree and a table, for example, by the time of especially later Platonism, when we come to the great authorities of Iamblichus, Porphyry, Plotinus, Proclus, we see that dialectic has really taken more the shape that we see in dialogues such as Plato's Phaedrus, and especially in his Symposium, when in the speech of Diotima talks about how to kind of use philosophic reasoning to ascend from the gross to the subtle, from the visible to the invisible, from the corporeal to the incorporeal. And this Plotinus took and made a basis of the practical way that we can engage with philosophy to benefit our spiritual path. This approach to dialectic isn't just something that Plotinus does. This is something that we see in Buddhism. This is something we see in a lot of Buddhist philosophy. This is something we see in a lot of Jnana Yoga teachings and vichar, such as Atma Vichar. Self-inquiry is a very clear dialectic process. Things like the Diamond Cutter Sutra and other important Buddhist texts, we see philosophic processes happening that really kind of follow this idea of what dialectic is. So it's a way of analyzing things, and Plotinus defines dialectic as a way of determining real being from apparent being. He talks about this in his Enneads, that through the dialectic process, we can determine the real nature of something as being different from what it appears to be. What is something's essential state? What is something's innate nature, as opposed to what we associate with that thing? And when we do this for spiritual cultivation, we ourselves are the actual object of the dialectic. So we're investigating our own nature, and we're trying to separate what appears to be true about ourselves from what is actually true about ourselves. We're trying to separate what appears to be who we are and what we are from what we actually are. And we're using logic and reasoning as part of this process. So what I wanted to do today is give some practical examples of both a more Platonic approach to the dialectic process and a little bit more of an Oriental and Buddhist approach to the dialectic process, which will both approach the issue of reality a little differently. They'll come to it from slightly different angles, which is why I wanted to look at kind of two different processes for it that can help you in your daily spiritual practice and self-reflection. First, we'll look at dialectic in the Platonic tradition and how it was approached and practiced within the teachings of Platonism. One of the things that you're trying to accomplish with dialectic in the Platonic process, the way that they understand the spiritual process involved in dialectic, is that you're moving through these states of knowledge. And we have another episode actually that goes into this more comprehensively. And what this issue is moving from a place of what's called double ignorance in Platonism to single ignorance to knowledge, meaning the way that Plato understands the movement from ignorance to knowledge, which is really at the center of all spiritual traditions, is that we are ignorant as to our real nature, and we need to have certainty as to our real nature. So the way that Plato understands this process is that we have what's called double ignorance, which means that you don't know something. Then we have single ignorance, which means that you know that you don't know something. You know that you actually have no assumptions or beliefs about it that are true and correct. Then we have real knowledge, which is that you have a kind of certainty. You know that you know something. And in Platonism, the root of all evils is double ignorance. All of our problems are caused by things that we think we know that we actually don't know, meaning we don't know that we don't know them. This is prevalent in politics, it's prevalent in just about every form of social discourse, political discourse, even religious discourse, spiritual discourse. Many spiritual teachers fall under this problem as well. It's when really we just have opinions and guesses and deductions about things, but there's not a lot of reasoning, no investigation. We have no reason to think we know the things that we know. We're not an expert on it. We didn't educate in it. We didn't learn it from someone who knew it. We haven't spent a long time reflecting on the matter. We just somehow the human mind is able to just generate opinions about anything and everything. And so this opinion-making process, which is part of our imagination, is at the root of how Plato understood ignorance, that we get so caught up in our opinions and belief structures about things and our conditioning that we lose all ability to actually engage intelligently with things, to actually think intelligently about ourselves and about the world around us. So much of Platonic dialectic is about purifying ourselves of our belief structures. We have double ignorance about a lot of things. And from the spiritual perspective, which Plato goes more deeply into in his dialogue, the Alcibiades, from the spiritual perspective, we are incredibly ignorant about ourselves. We really have no good idea. We don't have a good scope of what we know and what we don't know. We get caught up in lots of beliefs and opinions, and we're carrying with us a tremendous set of opinions that are just inherited from conditioning, from other people, from religious things, from societal, cultural norms. We're carrying with us a tremendous set of beliefs and opinions that we have not investigated. We haven't actually determined what the validity is of these beliefs and opinions. We haven't actually considered what their worth might be, if any at all. So the dialectic process in Platonism, when it comes to our spiritual cultivation, is about turning this analysis inwards and trying to evaluate really important things about life. What is life? What is being? What does it mean to be happy? Why do you do anything that you do? There's a number of key questions you kind of have to circle through before you jump straight in and take a bite of the problem of what am I? What is the self? Now, some spiritual traditions go straight to that. They go straight to the meat of the issue, straight to the heart, which is who am I? What is it to be? But actually, in the dialectic process of Platonism, there's a lot of other routes we can take, a lot of other questions we can ask to begin to have a better idea about how to approach this central issue of what is the self. And it comes through evaluating all of our ideas about life, because if we ourselves are very corporeal, if we're physically based, then we're going to have a lot of physical ideas about life, and we're going to want physical things from life. But if we aren't physical, if there's something incorporeal in our nature, we're going to want incorporeal things from life. And dialectic helps us understand that everything we want in life is incorporeal. Happiness, success, safety, achievement, validation, recognition, love, beauty, wisdom, grace, all these things that we actually want in life. The reason why we do everything else. It's all incorporeal. So the dialectic process helps us by asking questions like, what is life? What do I think the purpose of life is? And diving into that deeply, asking yourself, why do I do anything that I do? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Why do I go to work? Why do I want money? Why, almost like a child asking why? This is the basic of the Platonic approach to dialectic, is to deeply and profoundly question our own belief systems, our own values, our own opinions, and then see that we have a lot of opinions about all these things. We have opinions about what the purpose of life is. If someone asked you, you would spout something out. The problem from the perspective of Plato is that you would just spout something out, something you hadn't reflected on, something that you didn't know. Yet you would, because it's an opinion, you would have a strong conviction about it. People have a conviction about their opinions that can border on aggression and violence even, because belief and opinion are deeply connected with each other. Really, the only difference is if it's something really important, we call it a belief. And if it's something fairly trivial, we call it an opinion. So the dialectic process in Platonism moves through these basic questions. And you can read some examples of this, particularly in the Symposium and in the Alcibiades, where we walk through aspects of the dialectic process, where we learn how to examine ourselves. Why do I think I know this? Who did I learn it from? Was there ever a time I thought I didn't know this? This is really important. Was there ever a time where you truly knew that you had no idea what life is about, where you truly knew that you didn't know who you are? Was there ever a time where you reached those points? Was there ever a time where you learned it? Because if you didn't learn it, there's no reason to think you now know it. So there's a lot in the dialectic approach of Platonism that isn't just meant to be spiritual. It's meant to affect many areas of our life. And in that way, it's a little different than some Eastern forms and Oriental forms of dialectic approach and philosophic analysis, because it doesn't reject the world. Platonism tends to not really reject the world, but rather accept it and want to have a healthy relationship with it. So the dialectic process is often things that help you have a more beautiful relationship to the world instead of lead you to renouncing the world. And in the process, help you have a more beautiful relationship with yourself as well. Now, how does this Platonic approach differ from some of the more popular nowadays Advaitic and Buddhist approaches to it? The chief difference really is what the main object of inquiry is. So and even that ends up defining how they approach the problem. Because in Platonism, reality is full of things. It's called the pleroma. So the one is called the pleroma. It's full of all kinds of incredible qualities, which is why it gives birth to everything, though it itself is totally and entirely one. Whereas from the Buddhist perspective, the one is shunyata. It's void. It's empty. And again, that voidness, it's still full. It's often given traits. But one of the things that you do in Buddhist dialectic that's quite different from Platonic dialectic is in Platonic dialectic, you're trying to better understand in some way your relationship with the world, the relationship between the subject and the object, the relationship between the knower and the known, so that you can learn more about both of them. And it's a more positive approach. Platonism is has a very positive worldview called elampsis, or illumination. And so all illuminationist philosophy is a very positive worldview. The world was created due to the proliferation and abundance of the One. In Buddhist, there's often a more negative approach, and negative not morally, but negative just practically, logically, where instead of trying to understand positive things about yourself or make positive assertions and conclusions about yourself, you're trying instead to show that any attempt to make a positive assertion about yourself can fail. And so the Buddhist dialectic process involves deeply analyzing your nature and what it is to have traits, and then seeing, is there any positive assertion you can make about your real nature? Do you exist within time? Do you exist within space? Do you have size? Do you have shape? And, if you say, well, yes, the body has these, then now you dive in. Well, is there anything within the body that is me? Why am I associating myself with the body? And you move through and see that no part of your body can be asserted as the self. So then you do the same thing with the mind, and you see no part of the mind can be asserted as the self. And then you do the same thing with every concept you can have, with voidness, with emptiness. Do any of these apply? And you keep falling short. The ability to relate an objective trait to something totally subjective keeps failing. So the Buddhist approach, which goes far beyond the concept of a personal self, and Platonism has a lot of teachings about the personal self, because the old Greek cultures believed in the soul. And the soul isn't really a prevalent part of Buddhist philosophy. If it exists at all in some of the old teachings, it's supposed to be immediately kind of annihilated into the vastness of the One. Arguably, all schools of dialectic and mystical contemplation result in a annihilation into the One. Plotinus teaches this as well with the dialectic school of Platonism. But it's still a relationship of the soul to the One in Platonism. In Buddhism, you're even going beyond the soul, because the soul has actions. It has actions within space and time. It has volition and willpower. And even these things, you're trying to see, well, there are times where I'm not doing anything. There's times where there's no willpower being expressed. There's times where there's no volition. So what is it that remains even when nothing whatsoever is happening? What is it that was here before birth that remains after death? Is there something subtler than even the mind, something subtler than even the rational impulses that give birth to all my actions throughout life? So Buddhist dialectic is much more like a sword that removes even yourself from yourself. In Platonic dialectic, the sword is cutting off all of your ideas and opinions about yourself, so that you can try to arrive at something positive about your own nature. And in Platonism, it's not really necessary that you arrive at some kind of supreme ultimate truth. It's simply necessary that you don't associate yourself with a bunch of ignorant concepts. And if you avoid association with those ignorant concepts, then knowledge about yourself will arise. And really, Plato is happy as long as you know yourself to be incorporeal. In Buddhist dialectic, you even have to cut through the incorporeal aspects of things. That's called the formless realm of the gods. You have to cut through even formless assertions, even incorporeal assertions about your own nature, such as I am incorporeal, I am not the body. Even those things have to ultimately be let go of as a form of clinging to existentialism or to nihilism, until you end up at what is seen as a self-evident inherent truth. And this is the basis of much Advaitic dialectic as well, like we see from Adi Shankaracharya. The Advaitic dialectic and Buddhist dialectic have a lot of things in common, and we're largely responses to each other socially and culturally. So what is the practical, actual exercise of dialectic? What does it look like to sit and engage in a dialectic contemplation? And first I'm going to demonstrate the more Platonic approach to dialectic, and then we're going to go over a more Buddhist approach to dialectic. When we engage in dialectic in a Platonic way, we can start with anything, which is one of the beautiful things about it. We can start with anything in our environment, anything about ourselves, and then we can begin to analyze it. We can begin to try to understand it. And what I'm going to teach you is a kind of forward and backwards approach to dialectic, where when we're analyzing something, first we analyze it in one direction, from the apparent thing to the unapparent thing. And then and the unapparent is almost always going to be more general. And Platonic dialectic, we're always moving from something very specific to something general and universal. That's the nature of all Platonic philosophy. It's from parts to wholes, from the particular to the universal. And when we get to that more universal principle, then what we're going to do is engage in the dialectic process, starting with that universal principle, and work ourselves backwards, back to the particular. And when we do it that way, we're going to see that our approach somehow changes. Our ideas about these questions begin to change. Some of the questions become a little bit more uncomfortable because we're going to assume certain chains of causation when we first analyze it that may not stand up to observation when we kind of try to reverse engineer the reasoning. So I just want to show very simply something practically about how to do this. And I'm going to start with something simple. I'm just going to take a cup of coffee. So I have a cup. Just a little mug with some drink or coffee in it. And I love coffee, drink it all the time. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to take my cup of coffee and I'm going to ask, why do I drink coffee? Simple question. Incredibly simple. This is what I love about Platonic philosophy. And in Platonic philosophy, another wonderful thing, I don't need to question the validity of the existence of coffee or the cup of a coffee. In Buddhist philosophy, I have to get a little nitpicky. I have to kind of question whether or not coffee is real at all, and kind of go from that approach. Because of the fact that I live my daily life as though coffee is real and I like to have my coffee, I can start with just coffee itself. I can assume coffee is real and start to ask questions about it. So, and the first thing I'll do, because usually Platonic dialectic is somewhat moralistic, I'm going to ask, why do I want to drink coffee? Instead of what is coffee. Buddhist dialectic tends to be a little bit more focused on phenomenology. What is an object? Platonic dialectic is more like, what's the why? What's the moralistic basis of what you're doing? So I start out asking, why do I want to drink my coffee? And now I'm going to try to have an existential crisis about this. This is one of the things. Platonism is meant to lead us to a kind of existential crisis. So we can take something as simple as why do I want to drink coffee and really create a serious dilemma about the whole thing, which is kind of a fun exercise. So I give simple answer. Well, I want to be more awake. I want to be more alert, right? Coffee is caffeine. I could say I like it, but that takes us a little bit, shortens the quest a little bit. And I like this idea that of trying to justify coffee, which is something that we tend to do when people question us about why we do things, is instead of just giving a simple practical answer, we often try to justify it. So I'm going to try to justify by drinking a coffee and say that, well, it makes me more awake, it makes me more alert, and I enjoy that feeling. I want the rush of the caffeine. I want to feel more awake and alert. So then my next question is, now I question that. Right? I just, like a child, I keep asking why. I say, okay, well, why do I want to be more awake and more alert? And maybe I'll say because I want to work more efficiently. Right? When I'm more awake, when I'm more alert, I'm more productive at work. I can get things done better. I'm more task-oriented. I don't get exhausted as much by accomplishing the tasks that I have to do for that day. I just feel like I can do the day better. I feel like I'm a better worker and more productive. So then again, we ask again, well, why do you want to be more productive? Why do you want to be a better worker? And I'm going to say, because I want to be more successful, right? So now I've gone from drinking coffee to wanting to be more successful. That somehow my coffee drinking is, in my own mind, related to success. Because if I drink coffee, I'm more awake and alert. If I'm more awake and alert, it'll make me more productive, a better worker. If I'm a better worker, that'll lead to being more successful long term in my life. So then I ask, why do I want to be more successful? Why should that matter to me whatsoever? Why should success matter to anybody? In this case, I'm just going to stick it with me though. Well, why should I want to be more successful? So then I'm going to say, well, because to my mind, I'm convinced that if I'm more successful career-wise or work-wise, I am somehow going to have a better life. Right? There's this idea that if a person is more successful financially, personally, they are going to lead a better life. And because I've associated this with work here, I'm going to say that specifically success in work, being a successful person in my career field, will enable me to live a more, what I perceive as a better life. Meaning in some way this better life has to be connected to the fruits of my work. And then finally the question, well, why do I want to live a better life? What's wrong with your life right now? What's happening right now that you want to change it? You want it to be better. And finally, I'm going to end up at this kind of situation where it's that I want to be happy. I feel that in some way, A better life, which is a more successful life, is going to make me happier, which is to say that if I drink my coffee, I feel that somehow long term, my daily coffee drinking is going to be more conducive to my goal of living a happier life. One of the interesting things about Platonic dialectic, when you keep asking why about things, especially in a kind of moralistic sense, you often end up at, I want to be happier. In fact, Aristotle goes so far as to say that you will always end up at this final idea. I want to be happier. In some way, shape, or form, everything that I'm doing whatsoever is because I want to be happier. Even if I'm doing something that makes me miserable, it's because I feel I deserve misery, and therefore I'm happy with what I deserve. So this is going one direction now. I started with my cup of coffee. I ended at happiness. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with happiness and try to end at my cup of coffee. And when I do it this way, it's a bit of a different experience. It's not just the same thing in reverse, because what ends up when you flip it this way, you get to question your chains of causation. You get to question, do these things really arise from each other the way that I'm assuming they do? So if I start with the question of happiness, then I can say, well, does happiness actually come from a better life? Because when I was going forward, I said I want to live a better life because it'll make me happy, right? It'll give me some kind of more lasting happiness. So then now when I reverse it, I have to kind of question this. Does happiness arise from the kind of better life that arises from being successful at work? Because that was my chain of progression. I said, well, if I'm successful at work, I'll have a better life, which generally means I'll have more money, I'll have better resources, healthcare will be more affordable, housing will be more affordable, education will be more affordable, food will be more affordable, I'll have vehicles and, savings, so on and so forth. So the first question, when we question this, say, well, does happiness actually come from that kind of life? Now, this is a loaded issue. In fact, this is the issue of a lot of spirituality, is can we find any example whatsoever of people living that kind of life who are unhappy? Can we find people who thought that these two things were connected, a better life and being happy, and their better life being associated with work, with success in their work field? Can we find people who are very successful, have all the things we want, right? All the things that we feel will make our life better and therefore happier, but they're somehow miserable. They're married with kids and they're miserable. They got plenty of cars in the driveway and they're miserable. They have a beautiful home, a waterfront property, and they're miserable. They have great health care and they're miserable. They can afford all the best psychiatric medicine and they're depressed. Can we see examples where these two things aren't actually connected, maybe, the way we think they are? So this is our first step. Does happiness come from the kind of better life we're talking about? Then again, we question, does that kind of better life actually come from success at work? Does being really successful with work actually increase the quality of your life whatsoever? Are there examples of people who have said that their success ruined their life? Are there examples of people who have said that being very successful at work ruined everything else in their life? Right? Maybe they were so successful at work, but because of how successful they were at work, they were completely unsuccessful with things like family, with parenting, personal relationships, psychological well-being. Maybe their physical health fell apart as a result of how much they gave to their work. So do these things necessarily have a relation with each other? Does this kind of better life people are looking for actually come from career success? And then again, we go back even more. Well, then does career success actually come from being more awake and alert? And then we can go from just being more awake and alert actually happen from coffee. In other words, do I work more effectively? Am I actually more productive when I drink coffee? Am I actually more functional at work when I drink coffee? And, as we get closer to the coffee itself, the answers tend to be a little easier. Like, yeah, you may actually work more effectively when you drink coffee. Most of us have reasoned out really well at least one reason why we do what we do. The issue, which Platonic dialectic is meant to help us see, is that we're really bad at our second and third whys. So we're not good at creating a chain of whys. We have a decent why one time. Why do you drink coffee? I want to be more awake and alert. And then maybe even the second one. Well, why do you want to be more awake and alert? Oh, so I can be more successful, more productive at work. But then as we get deeper and deeper, as we go towards more universal structures, we start to become aware of some ideas and opinions we have that might not stand up to any reasoning, might not stand up to any logic. We may have no reason whatsoever to think that being more successful at work will make us happy. But because we've never investigated the subject once, we just assume it as an opinion. And this is something that dialectic is meant to show us, especially from the Platonic perspective. It's meant to help us question our belief structures, because the more that we do things, the more we'll see, the more that we question things, the more that we're going to see that we're trying to be happy. And what Platonic dialectic will do is it will force us to constantly evaluate what happiness is, what it means, and how it's achieved, which is one of the beautiful things about it. When we engage in Buddhist dialectic, we're going to just kind of cut straight to a more metaphysical approach. Platonic dialectic often isn't blatantly or apparently metaphysical until you get a few steps into it. Whereas Buddhist dialectic is all about trying to prove or disprove the existence of an individual or independent entity called the self. And it requires a Buddhist and Upanishadic view of the self. It's not the way Plato would understand the self as the jiva or the soul. It's the way Buddha understands the term of the self. Is there any kind of independent entity whatsoever that can be, any kind of affirmation can be made about? Or does such an entity not exist? And this is, you're really assuming that this is a conundrum. You're assuming that this is an issue when you begin your Buddhist dialectic, because you're trying to either prove or disprove the teachings of the Buddha, which is one of the incredible things about Buddhist dialectic, is Buddha's basically saying, prove me wrong. Right? Buddha's saying, this is what I've taught, that there is no self. Now you, for yourself, see if you can prove this, see if I'm correct, see if I'm incorrect, see if there's any logical basis to think otherwise. Is there any logical basis to think that there is an independent entity? And a lot of times they go straight to things, can I make this assertion about myself? Is happiness or not happy, alive, dead, so on and so forth. But what I find very useful is actually to take Aristotle's categories. And if you take Aristotle's categories, really, it's 10 different categories where he talks about all the different ways we can attribute traits and qualities to beings. That some traits are inherent, some traits are accidental, some traits are inherited. What's the difference between the genus and species? And if an iron is hot, is it innately hot? Is it part of the iron's nature to be hot? Or is that an accidental trait? Something else made it hot? Is it a permanent trait? Like, is it an accidental trait it can never shed? Or is it a temporary accidental trait? So how do these traits affect or operate within space and time? Does it have height? Does it have width? Does it have weight? Does it have substance? Does it inherit any accidental traits? Is there anything that can be attributed to it? Can it be affected in any way whatsoever by something else? Does it have its own movement, or does it have to be moved by other things? These are kind of Aristotelian categories about how anything can be understood. And one of the beautiful things about Aristotle's categories is they really haven't changed over the years philosophically, logically. There's only so many ways we can talk about something. There's only so many ways we can what's called predicate or attribute traits to things. And this is what Buddha is trying to see, is can you predicate anything of the self? Can you make any kind of positive assertion about an independent entity called the self? And if you cannot, then perhaps such an entity is not real, doesn't actually exist, and that's why it can't be predicated of anything. So if you take Aristotle's categories, you end up kind of having a little practical workbook in terms of questioning the traits that may or may not be inherent in the self. So you can ask yourself, do I actually have form? Do I have dimension? And if you say yes, because you might begin associating yourself with the physical body, then again, you have to kind of reorient yourself towards a more Upanishadic idea of the self, which means the witness, the viewer. And the object is the known, not the knower. So likewise, the body, if you say, well, yes, the body has shape and structure, but do I feel myself to have boundaries like that? Do I feel that the witness has shape and form? And this will require deeper thought. It's Buddhist dialectic requires very subtle reasoning. So then you have to ask, well, did I feel smaller, for example, not as a physical body, but as a living being, as a consciousness, as the subject, as the witness? Did I feel myself to exist in a somehow smaller way when I was physically younger and smaller than I do now when I'm physically taller and larger? Did I feel that my actual nature increased, right? And then if I'm alive, well, all things that are living, they grow and they die. So then again, you have to look in the mirror and ask yourselves, do I feel that I have aged? Now, of course, your body feels it has aged, right? Which is obvious once you get in your 30s. But do you feel, for example, when you looked in the mirror when you were 5, and when you look in the mirror when you're 50, do you feel that the witness has aged even one day? Do you feel that somehow you exist less at 50 than you did when you were 5? Do you feel you'll exist less when you're 80 or 90 years old? Will you exist less right before your death? Because if the answer is no, if the answer is that you feel your sense of personal existence has always been there and not fluctuated with time, you didn't feel yourself to be less existent when you were younger and more existent when you were older, then that means time isn't affecting the witness, or at least it's not affecting it in any kind of, or if it is affecting it, it's affecting it in a huge time span, maybe thousands or millions of years, but not enough for you to have noticed during one physical life. Have you ever felt that your existence is hot or cold? Have you ever felt that the witness experiences pain in its own being, that existence itself is experiencing pain? This is kind of how you can approach this dialectic process. What you're trying to do is see, can any trait whatsoever be positively attributed to the witness? Can even witnessing be attributed to the witness? And one of the beautiful things of Buddhist dialectic is that it is so clearly metaphysical and clearly oriented towards enlightenment and realization. But one of the things that I feel it struggles with a little bit for a typical practitioner is that it's so subtle. The reasonings involved in Buddhist dialectic actually require that you are experienced with deep levels of meditation. Not necessarily at the beginning, but when you start going into subtler questions, like can knowledge, for example, be asserted? Can even the title of the knower be asserted about yourself? This requires such subtle levels of experience of your own nature to be able to make conclusions that if you aren't a deep meditator, you're not actually going to be able to make positive assertions because you haven't experienced yourself without your 5 senses. You haven't experienced yourself beyond the bounds of space and time. You haven't had direct experiences of yourself to exist beyond all memory in a state where there was no recollection of you ever having been born. You haven't experienced nirvikalpa samadhi, where everything disappears into a kind of vacuous state of being. So because of this is, to my mind at least, one of the shortfalls of Buddhist dialectic, is this problem that some of the higher stratums of the issue become difficult for people who are not really advanced meditators. So it's a nice way, anybody can get started with it. It's a nice thing to start with, and it can help you go into deeper levels of meditation. But ultimately, Buddhist dialectic is meant to kind of grow alongside your personal meditative path, where the analytical wisdom and reasoning is meant to be a supplement to your daily spiritual practice so that you can better understand your practice, and then your practice leads to greater understandings. And then your greater understandings help you advance in your practice, and then your advancement in your practice leads to even more greater understandings. And this is this feedback process, this loop back and forth between meditative experience and analytical wisdom that is such an important role in Buddhist spiritual teachings and traditions. I don't think that it really matters which pursuit or which approach you take, whether you take a more Oriental or Buddhist or Hindu philosophic approach to dialectic, or you take a more Platonic approach to dialectic. I think most householders living a busy life will probably resonate or get more out of the Platonic approach at first, whereas advanced meditators are probably going to feel that they can get more out of the Buddhist approach to dialectic. But either way, the purpose is that, or the point is that through analytical wisdom and reasoning, you can unassociate, you can kind of disassociate yourself a little bit from a problematic association you keep making over and over, right? Which is that you're associating yourself with different phenomena, different objects, different mindsets or opinions or beliefs that may not stand up to any basic reasoning. And from the Platonic perspective, you're associating with ideas and mindsets that may not hold up to logic at all, or they may be completely irrational, and therefore they're problematic. Right? They're going to lead to mistakes about yourself and mistakes mistakes about the world. From the Buddhist perspective, you're associating with things that aren't your nature. But then in the process of trying to determine what your real nature is, you're ultimately meant to arrive at a conclusion that there is no such thing as one's innate nature. They're simply being itself without any individual entity. So more advanced meditators may appreciate that, whereas people caught in the hustle of daily life might appreciate a more Platonic approach to it. And so I thought it would be interesting in today's episode to look a little bit at both of these and give some practical examples and guidance into each of them. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video.